scares me. So this session, we are looking at climate change and border security. So taking another one of these non-traditional threats to border security that we've been talking about. And what the point of this session is to get you thinking a little bit differently in how we are conceptualizing threats to our borders, issues with our borders, and how we can think forward into what can your roles be, what can our roles be in how we treat borders in a very, very changing world. And one of the aspects of that is, of course, climate. So I'm really pleased that today we've got Allanah O'Hanlan with us, who I think, Allanah, can you just let me know if you can hear us okay, and if you're there?
All good, Jamie.
Perfect. Thank you. So thank you to Allanah for joining us. It is currently 6:30 in the morning in Australia. So she's up bright and early to join us. But Allanah, like I said, currently works for Australian Border Force in Customs and Trade Compliance, although that is soon to be changing, I understand, but still with ABF. So she's got over 15 years experience in the public and private sectors in immigration and trade. So brings a really good wealth of experience from both of those perspectives. Allanah also she has 2 master's degrees, one in intelligence analysis, one in anti-money laundering and counterterrorism financing, both from Charles Sturt University in Australia, and holds a bachelor's in international business from Griffith University. She's been working in immigration and customs, like I said, in various capacities for around 15 years, and has a really strong interest in border security and the expanding remit of customs administration. So Allanah showed a huge interest in moving the agency forward, and I think that's why we talk quite often and work together on a number of things, because Allanah's quite a forward thinker, and I think is really suited to these climate conversations, because you really think outside the box and you come up with different policy recommendations. You have come up with a number of policy recommendations for the agency. And I think it's really good for us all to have this conversation about what everyone's roles can be in this really challenging environment. So thank you again, Allanah, for joining us. So the kind of, let's get through that. What we're going to tackle today, I'm going to start it off with framing what some of the issues are that we're talking about here. Now, I'm not a climate scientist by any stretch of the imagination. That's not what I do. We're doing border security and security studies here. So it's bringing in what we know about climate change and infusing that with our border security framework. So that's what we're going to be focusing on. So I'm going to frame this, the climate change as a whole, what the consequences are, climate as a security threat and a specific threat to border security. And then Allanah is going to take it away and talk about supply chains, knowledge for customs or border officers. I don't want to narrow just to customs. I know that that's not where everyone that specifically works. And policy and innovation. So what are some of the things that we can do to move this portfolio forward? So I'll kick it off with a few slides here. I'm going to try to keep this to 10-15 minutes, and hopefully I don't get too carried away. You can just, Christian here next to me can kick me if I start talking too much. But essentially, to bring this into perspective and thinking about some of the contemporary challenges around climate change, and think about this from your own regional perspectives. I know every region has very different challenges when we start talking about climate, how you've been affected by that, and can you match how everyone's been affected by that, and how we're going to need to tackle that in the future from our own regional perspectives. And this is a very cross-border issue. There is not just, we can't tackle this just from a state perspective. So that's what we can kind of think about going through. So this clip that's up on the screen right now, this was the UN SDG report from 2022. And it's just a bit of a snapshot about some of the challenges that we're facing globally right now. And obviously these all have trickle down effects for everyone's region. So in terms of, we know the biggest contributor to climate change are CO2 emissions. And they are reaching the highest level ever, which I'll show in a couple slides as well. It is increasing every single year on quite a steep trajectory. It's kind of appropriate that we're having this conversation today. I actually got a news pop-up right before this session that a report was just released. That's last Sunday, so just, is it today, Tuesday? So 2 days ago was the hottest day ever recorded on record on the globe. and on the planet. So we are facing some obviously very real challenges based on that. I won't walk through all of those. So this one shows, and I'm taking this concept from Simon Dalby, who's another friend of Borders Globalization, and has been talking on ecological borders this week. Now, the way that he likes to conceptualize this, and I really liked it because it kind of opened my eyes to the changes that we're seeing generationally here. Find where you were born on this. This was when CO2 emissions started being tracked. And find where you were born on here and what it was like in that year. And look where we are now. So there are people, what about those being born in 2020? What is their world going to look like with these CO2 emissions climbing as they are and with no sign of really slowing down without global commitment to that? Next one. So we want to look at some of the consequences just quickly here. So we know that there has been a real increased frequency and severity of, I don't like the word natural disasters at all. None of these are natural. These are, the human fingerprint is all over most of these disasters that we're facing, aside from things like earthquakes for the most part. So hurricanes, floods, droughts, these are man-made disasters and caused largely by those increasing emissions in our atmosphere, greenhouse gases, and the like. Now, what we see from that, melting ice caps and glaciers. And we saw that question come up yesterday, actually. And I'm pleased that the question came up about the Arctic. It was Eric, I believe, asked the question about, well, what are we doing with trade policies in the north with trade routes being affected by glaciers disappearing? There's going to be more volume. What do we do in those passages with more volume coming into our ports? How are we going to adjust our resources for that? So that's a really important thing to be thinking about. And our shifts in ecosystems and our biodiversity loss. The challenges that we're looking at in terms of biodiversity loss by flooding, by fires. We've seen that across British Columbia. I think this year has been the worst on record for fires, followed by last year, followed by the year before. It's getting progressively worse, and that it's been tracked since 2017. The number of forest fires in British Columbia have surpassed any other year before 2017, and it's continually growing. So there are significant socioeconomic consequences from that. I'm sure you're all across the raging forest fires and droughts and everything, so I don't want to talk too much about that. But what are the consequences? What does this all mean? And then we'll get into some of the border stuff. But when we talk about the agriculture and food security, for one, that is a huge consequence of these increased frequencies of disasters, the melting ice caps, shifts in ecosystems. The climate variability impacts regions that are really reliant on agriculture, for example. So in Afghanistan is one really big example of this. There's about 20 million people within the country. That's almost the entire population of Australia that are facing food insecurity. And 80% of the livelihoods depend on agriculture. So when we have this severe biodiversity loss, what does that mean for security of people in light of agriculture and food security? Drought, desertification, that is all really impacting that side of security. We talk about the displacement of populations and migration pressures. Massive issue in the Pacific Islands right now and other island states around the world. But in terms of the Pacific, we look at Tuvalu, Kiribati, Solomon Islands. They are all being submerged by rising sea levels. They are sitting at about 10 feet above sea level. So when the water's rising, we're pushing people further and further in. The many Pacific Islands are going to be completely uninhabitable by 2100. So that's in 75, 76 years. So people being born now, did I do that math right? Terrible. 25 years. People being born now, living till 75, will not have their home state to live in. So that is going to cause not only a rebordering issue, we're talking about borders here, those international borders will effectively disappear. There will be no islands there and no people there. In terms of strain on infrastructure and resources. There's a lot of infrastructure around the world that was constructed many years ago, nuclear power in Canada, for example, since the 50s, 60s. Well, those were constructed in a time when the rivers, lakes, and sea that the water being drawn on to cool those plants was a lot cooler. So now when we're talking about nuclear power is needed most in the summer when people are trying to run their air conditioning more and more because we are getting hotter and hotter, having warmer summers. Now, the water that's being used to cool them actually now is having to go through more dramatic cooling processes. That wasn't thought of when these plants are being constructed. And now with conversations, for example, in Australia about nuclear power being brought on in about 2040, they're hoping, we might not have the actual resources that are needed to run such plants. So it does put strains on certain infrastructures and resources, and that, like, of course, many other challenges to that as well. So these are just a couple kind of pictures from this light. This was a minister from Tuvalu who, instead of traveling to COP26 the year that, I can't remember where it was in 2026, so 2 years ago, he decided to give his speech to COP26 knee deep in water in Tuvalu to show that our island is starting to sink. And it sent quite a loud message at that point. Did the policies really change? Was there any real help there? Not really, but the imagery, I think, is quite stark there. And then, of course, the sea levels rising. This is just showing, if we look at borders being pushed in, talking again about borders and what that means in terms of our regions and what this is going to look like for negotiation of land, resources, where people are going to live, and what that means for migration as well. Richard and Duncan were just talking about migration pressures, and Richard brought up influxes of refugees and asylum claims. Well, refugees from climate-affected countries are going to be the biggest challenge right now in terms of displacement. The highest number of refugee movements are due to climate. So this has severe implications for how we all start thinking beyond our own borders about what these real challenges are. So we move into climate change as a security threat. When we look at the national and international security implications from this, climate change is often, and I think rightfully, looked at as a threat multiplier. So anything that is currently a challenge within a lot of our own countries and abroad, these changes to our climate and ongoing changes to our climate are going to make those more intense. They're going to multiply them further, pushing food scarcity into potential conflict and continuing along that kind of a vicious cycle there. It really intensifies resource scarcity. So it's something that we need to look again beyond our borders to sort and hopefully provide some policy frameworks moving forward about how we can cooperate on those things to ensure that that our regions are more secure. It also worsens our existing social, economic, and environmental consequences. So I think one of the big issues here are, and to bring an example in Somalia, for example, and I know the Sahel region is a really good example as well about the years of conflict and border fragility. So our fragile borders are quite a big consideration when we start talking about, again, climate and these threat multipliers. Well, when we start adding in things like people cannot get food or water and are having to fight for the bare necessities to live, the current droughts that have past several decades of drought that have ravaged a lot of African countries, that really compounds these vulnerabilities. And it's going to shift and going to cause shifts for displacement as well, and people moving. In terms of the economic side, we all know how important trade is in our globalized world. We've been talking a lot about that again over the past few days. What does this mean for how we look at global supply chains and global supply chain security. So there are a number of industries around the world that are very reliant on a single region. Well, what happens when that region is no longer tenable, when we can't have those resources there anymore? We're talking about agriculture in some lights. So when there's some countries are, I'll say Thailand, a lot of our Southeast Asian countries, very, very reliant on exports of certain agricultural goods. When our climate affects those industries, how do they survive? How are these export economies going to be able to shift their own operations when there is nothing to draw on? That results in people displacement as well. Not only that resource scarcity, but also people having to go elsewhere to look for ways to survive. Most of this is currently happening within states right now. It's pushing people inwards, essentially, especially our island nations, pushing people in. That can only last for so long. We need to think about in the future, how are we actually going to support the shifts to make sure people actually have resources to survive. Now, that also means trade routes. And I know Allanah is going to talk about this, so I'm not going to get too much into the trade routes, but they will be shifting. One of the things that we see in our current region here on the Pacific coast, the health of the Salish Sea is a massive concern. And looking at changing trade routes, essentially, so tankers aren't going through certain areas of our waters where salmon is already being forced to migrate elsewhere. Our orcas, the orcas that have lived off of the coast of British Columbia and Washington State for years, are being forced to move into different regions, sometimes into either colder or warmer waters where they have not evolved to live yet. So it causes a lot of, again, knock-on effects there. So when we look at border security, and I've gone over kind of the primary causes there and our key environmental impacts. So something, again, going back to yesterday, we framed a lot of the day around this coordination, cooperation, collaboration, not only within the regional levels, but we also need to look beyond that a little bit. Sorry, no, I'll come back to this. That's okay. So a big thing, and Allanah and I talk about this quite often, is the effects on our borderlands are undeniable, but we can look at this through the general kind of dialogue around climate, around mitigation and adaptation. Those are our two big streams for how are we going to deal with climate change. And it's really applicable to border, whether it's border security, customs, immigration, whatever area we want to look at this. I'm just going to say border practices and processes to make it so I don't have to say all those things all the time. But when we look at it from that perspective, so let's look at mitigation. What can we really encourage, or can we ourselves contribute to emissions reduction? The UN defines mitigation as the reduction of CO2 and reduction of emissions. Can we really do that from our perspectives and borders? Kind of. We can encourage those activities further down the supply chain. And when we're talking more about trade, less about people. But when we talk about adaptation, I think that's the most important thing from our perspectives to start thinking about, and how we can maintain security practices and processes when our world is so rapidly changing. When we look at, and I'll flip to the next just to kind of give a bit of visual around this. The Nooksack River a couple of years ago in Washington State overflowed. And so that was on that south side of the border there. The floodwaters poured into the Sumas River and then across the border into Abbotsford, British Columbia. So flooded on both sides of the border there. Now, what that meant was a number of the main supply highways and ports of entry were closed. What was done to actually adapt to that? Well, some shifts in the ways trucks were going and trains could get through. But what it ended up with, a lot of people being trapped, not being able to get food supplies out in lower mainland British Columbia. It was all kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? stopped, bottlenecked. That's the word I'm looking for. So it was harder to get those trade routes open. Now, that's just a really micro example. What about when we start looking at regions where there is actually no option to go to another port of entry that might be 100 kilometers down the road? And in this case, there was a real lack of preparation and coordination amongst the border agencies, surprisingly, in British Columbia and Washington. So while there was cooperation at a political level, it didn't actually flow down to the border level. So there was a lot of kind of scrambling, and what that meant is attention away from certain ports of entries and moving some of those goods along. So that opens up vulnerabilities. And when we look at that on a wider scale, when those resources are challenged at some of those borders, if we think bigger than this, again, small example, what does that mean if we have to shut an entire section of, say, 600 kilometers of border from along the BC line there? What does that mean for our own border security operations? How are people going to take advantage of that in one sense? But also, how do we make sure that trade can get through and that we can facilitate trade? That's a huge issue with border security, is facilitation. It's about economic integration, facilitation, not just about the traditional security sense as well. So that has a real impact on trade routes and supply chains. Now that's just kind of a picture of what that looks like. So if you can think about, your roads and resources being totally cut off, what can we do from a border perspective to actually look at that? What should we be doing to prepare for that? I think that's kind of and as Cal talked about earlier, these wicked problems need wicked solutions. So how can we kind of start thinking outside the box to actually prepare for some of these? Now, and as we talked about earlier, the melting Arctic ice as well is severely contributing to needing new trade routes in that sense. So go back to this just for that coordination cooperation side. Now, we also need to think about infrastructure vulnerability. So our ports, our border crossings, critical infrastructure can really be at risk from rising sea levels, from extreme weather, from fires that may ravage the area depending on where you are. Environmental health and threats is huge. So wildlife trafficking, if it's our shifts in ecosystems, and an increase in wildlife trafficking as certain species become more vulnerable because of that degradation of biosecurity as well. And that necessitates stricter enforcement and collaboration to protect endangered species. Our CITES agreement is how many decades old, and not really forward thinking into what's happening now with some species becoming more and more under threat. And we talk about migration and humanitarian issues. As we were talking about some of our Pacific Islands, especially, well, how do we deal with people that are very affected by these challenges? So one of the agreements that Australia came up with, Tuvalu, for example, population of about 100,000, but offered to resettle a number, I think it's 280 people per year, resettle in Australia, path to citizenship. But Tuvalu, they know that the island will no longer exist within projections show 60, 70 years, but again, no firm answer on that. But they don't want to leave. There is a connection to place and a connection to that land, and don't want to actually be forced to migrate. So also thinking beyond, well, we can just move people. It's not that easy. And does have to be respect for solutions that are developed with the people that this is most affecting. So that requires a lot of cooperation at a wider global level. Technological innovation is a big one. So this use of data analytics to predict and respond to climate-related disruptions is going to require a big concerted effort. Again, we can't just do this from a state level. This needs to happen both regionally and wider through. The UN has a lot of working groups dedicated towards this. There's thousands of different climate groups now, but it's all very piecemeal, and a lot of these agreements are ad hoc. So to actually come up with some cooperative, collaborative methods to start dealing with the the data that's needed for this. Capacity building and training, and I know Lana, you're going to talk about that a little bit as well. So I won't get into that too much. Community engagement from the regulation and policy side, green trade and green customs has come up a lot. So this is this implementation of really environmentally friendly trade policies like carbon tariffs and regulations on sustainable goods. And then, of course, with our international agreements. But before I just one last thing before I turn it over to Allanah here is, and when we'll come back to and ask some questions of all of you about, is thinking about the short-term and long-term challenges that we really need to tackle as a result of our changing climate. So when we deal with these acute challenges, fires, floods, wild weather, monsoons, that kind of thing, how can we deal with that from a border perspective in whatever kind of directorate that you work in? How are you able to better tackle that? But then also in terms of the long term, because the climate is changing as rapidly as it is, we're going to start having more discussions with things like a carbon border adjustment mechanism that's been implemented in the EU. We're going to have to start talking about altering our trade routes, for example, like I was talking about. But these all require building policies and recommendations around things that haven't necessarily happened yet. So when you have to come up with policies and practices and procedures around what could happen, because we can project, we can look at this is what the climate is going to look like in 40, 50, 60, 70, 100, 200 years. But how do we start adapting to what that means now? And the EU has taken the first step in carbon border adjustment mechanism and the requirement to purchase carbon credits and charging for trading across the border based on your emissions levels. So with that, I will turn it over to Allanah, who's going to talk a little bit more about the supply chains, the policy, and we'll come back to a bit of an activity after. I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Jamie. You can hear me okay? Good. Perfect. I actually haven't spoken to anybody this morning, so I think my voice hasn't started working yet. So it's always a pleasure listening to Jamie. I actually was a student of the Borders and Globalization Summit Institute a few years ago, and yeah, it's a really invaluable experience. So it's really wonderful to be back in a different capacity. So as Jamie mentioned, climate change and supply chains have a lot of interaction, and the impact can be really felt around the world. Like globalization has really allowed for us to get our goods faster, source more items, and really we're heavily reliant on secure supply chains for our everyday lives. Now, the impact of international trade is really key factor in increasing emissions. But supply chains also experience the impacts of climate change. And so the rising frequency and intensity of climate impacts, such as extreme weather events, or actually even the changing locations of the extreme weather events for locations that haven't actually experienced those previously. And also the slow onset impacts of rising seawater, droughts. They've actually posed a serious threat to transport infrastructure, and that is necessary for smooth and reliable supply chains. So, for example, if we're looking at extreme weather events, and we're not necessarily talking natural disasters, but we're talking extreme weather events, they can actually directly damage roads, bridges, ports, railway tracks, and disrupt air transport. But if we look at, say, a really great example of the direct impact on the supply chain and international trade, we can actually see in the Panama Canal that in 2023 they actually had to restrict trade and the ships passing through there due to how it's set up is that it relies on water coming in from lakes and rivers nearby to build up the passing through between the maritime uh, maritime through there between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. So because of reduced rainwater and the natural water that flows through there, they actually had to reduce the size of the ships that could go through, or tell the ships that they actually had to not have as many goods on there. So you can see that for the Canal, which has, um, I think about 6% of global trade goes through there, the contraction that it could have on international trade and the impact around the world if we are seeing those events occur. I actually thought that was a really, really interesting example of how, yes, we have a man-made transit point through there for ships. However, that supply chain and the trade route is needing to be reconsidered or significantly impacted just directly as a result of reduced rainwater from climate change. So the disruptions in climate change in supply chains require the businesses that are involved in that to pivot and really look at how they actually can build out resilience in their supply chains. And really, that costs more. So there's economic pressure driving up the price of goods, but also the increasing price of the shipping or transport costs. So, as we would have seen through COVID, there was significant pressure on shipping as a result of restrictions, but the impact on pricing increased the price of goods around the world, and we're still feeling that today. So a lot of the forums in Australia that we deal with, they do discuss the price of shipping as being a significant impactor on their ability to deliver goods to the Australian public. So that actually led to the WCEO's resolution on strengthening customs industry resilience. So that only was recently signed, I think, end of 2023. So that really looked to creating a more global trade environment that fostered industry resilience, stronger partnerships, and leveraged digital technology. So Jamie did mention that technology piece. Digital technologies allow greater data sharing, and I think there's a big push that I guess traditional customs work did involve a lot of paper and documentation to be cited, but really moving toward the digital footprint, not only to reduce the impact on the environment, but also to allow that faster processing and agility in responding to impacts on that are disruptive to global trade. So trade can act as a force multiplier, really, for climate change when we are cooperating, and digitization really allows that cooperation to and collaboration to occur because it allows us to decarbonize supply chains. Well, when I say us, it's industry really have a significant part to play here because businesses are ultimately driving the supply chains and the sourcing of goods. So working together with industry as customs or border agencies is really critical to moving to that next phase of building at that resilience piece in all the trade routes, our supply chains, how we interact with business and communicate, how at the border. So when I say communicate at the border, Australian Border Force spends a lot of time in industry forums. We work with businesses to look at what their disruptions are, what are their future needs, to really look in terms of that collaborative piece as to how we can manage the border better. Um, so I guess that really calls out to the next slide, which is really around that knowledge for customs officers, and appreciate from Jamie that not everybody here is a customs officer. But one of the questions that I've actually really found interesting is how we view responding to climate change versus environmental protection. Does anybody have any thoughts on the two based on your experiences over the last few days? Put your hand up. Don't be scared. I'm no, I'm terrifying, but nope. All right. Well, I don't think anybody did. I will push through. So really, environment protection, we've actually have a definition that we can work with. So the WCO look at environmental protection being something that is quite interlinked with climate change, but it's defined as any action to protect the environment by such means as conserving the environment, preventing and remedying harm to the environment, restoring the quality of the environment, and really from that, it's what I take and what I have taken from that. It's all about the natural environment. So we're looking at our actual our forests, our animals, and so we look at. If we're looking at responding to climate change, we're looking at not only just the physical environment, we're actually also looking at the impacts of climate change being um, migration and displacement. We're looking at the infrastructure impacts. We're looking at supply chain. So it's whilst environmental protection comes into it as and we have as customs officers a myriad of responsibilities under environmental protection. In the future, we will see that remit expanding to responding to climate change impacts. So the further we go along in, I guess, maturing our knowledge as border agencies and working with the WCO and other and industry, I would see that our responsibilities will um, be required to adapt and our increase of education, and I'll cover that separately, is that we will be required to know more and probably do more with less because a lot of the customs agencies that we deal with, we're not getting more resources, but we are continually required to take on more responsibilities, not necessarily just from an enforcement perspective, but also a legislative or knowledge perspective. So if I look at some WCO operations, we've got Operation Detmer that has had a few phases. So the first phase or the first edition um, dated back in 2009. So it was aimed in intercepting illegal shipments of hazardous waste, especially plastic waste and ozone depleting substances. Um, so that there is an operation that has directly uh, it call to can directly call to our response to climate change impacts. So we are looking to support the reduction of emissions. So intercepting illicit trade in waste and ozone depleting substances is really critical to our customs administration's response to climate change. Now, in terms of Detmer, that was an operation. It requires to be funded. And as WCO operations often are, they receive funding from a certain country. But the longevity of that is really difficult given that the funding doesn't last forever. So, if we're looking at our own work in our own countries, if uh, we can really see that operational efforts occur, but they're not necessarily built into the business as usual activities. There can be a tension there as to whether or not is it our responsibility. So it's advocating for that to be built into our business as usual activities. And then if I look at another operation or project that occurred that I think directly links to environmental protection is the Anama project. So the Anama project was under the framework of the environmental program to tackle illegal wildlife trade, so under the CITES Convention. So obviously we know wildlife trade is a big mechanism for transnational organized crime, but it is within our environmental protection um, remit. Now, in Australia, CITES, and I'm sure other countries, CITES is built into our business as usual activities. So we're managing uh, wildlife trade at the border every day. So that, whilst there may be uplift and I guess weeks of action or activities linked to that, um, CITES has been built for more further into our BAU activities in Australia than, say, DETMA has been. So I see the tension between environmental protection and responding to climate change as being part of business as usual activities and having that uplift across a whole of customs administrations. And that feeds into green customs. So the WCO really pursued the piece of green customs, and the World Trade Organization has also had a lot to say about green customs as well. And it was formed out of initial discussions between the WCO and the WTO. But in terms of green customs, the WCO established what the framework as to what they actually considered green customs, but really it relies on individual countries to set out their own frameworks as to how they manage that at the border. One of the challenges I see in that is that we're getting the information, but we're going to apply it in our own country. That really creates a siloed work environment. And one of the biggest challenges for responding to climate change is the siloed effect that we function within. So that collaboration, cooperation, and communication between agencies is really critical, I think, for uplift of green customs. So just because at the Australian border we're approaching it in a certain way, Fiji, who is uh, incredibly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, may be approaching it in a different manner. That's not allowing us to share accurate data or uplift at the same time. So I see green customs as really needing to move together to within regional geographic regions. So I see the Asia Pacific region as working together because we do suffer a lot of the same impacts of climate change in the Asia Pacific or the Indo Pacific. With that, we can't just move ahead without considering what the EU is doing. So it's really that piece that requires us to come together more. And the WCO obviously is really it is on their, I think, their strategy for the next up until 2026. Green customs it remains as a priority, but it's the investment into that by the countries to move that forward. But then, if we look at green customs and the Green Customs Action Plan, I'm not sure if really on the working level the capability uplift is there. So does anybody have any thoughts or has experience of green customs strategy or anything in their own country? Um, Anybody?
Great. Yeah, we've got a couple of hands raised. So, Anthony, I think you were first there. So let's start with yours. We can't.
I think you're on mute. You're on mute, Anthony.
Yeah, hello.
So sorry about
Yeah.
that. As I was saying, at Kenya, how we go about implementing the WCO green customs is that we, as much as possible, try to plant trees, adopt innovative measures such as technology to reduce on print paper, as well as a policy that would align to adhering to the same.
Okay.
Thanks for sharing that. And Benjamin?
Yeah, hello. Can you hear me? Can you hear me, please?
We can hear you.
Yes.
All right. Okay. Yes. So, talking about the Ghanaian experience with regards to green customs, we have formulated our strategic plan, and for the year 2023 to 2027, green customs is well embedded in our strategic plan. Beyond that, we are using our scientific unit to train officers on how to detect climate depleting substances that are usually imported into the country. So beyond this, we also try to control at the borders to ensure that substances, like I said, that depletes the ozone layer is also checked and prevented from coming in. So these and many other more things, which are usually handled by the scientific units of the Customs Division of the Ghana Revenue Authority, is how we're implementing the green customs. Like I said, it forms part of our strategic plan between the period of 2023 to 2027, and we look forward to make sure that we implement all the points in there. Thank you.
Thanks for sharing
Thank
that.
you. Thank you. Yes. And look, it's really, I think the starting point there is having that strategy or that first point of call for officers to work from. I guess the element of that is that siloed approach. Obviously without going knowing the details of it, but I do wonder, and I look at the Australian experience as to how much we are actually working with our neighbours to make sure there's synergy of process. Um, Obviously, how we manage the borders in Australia is different to how European or African nations actually would manage their border. Land borders create different experiences to see, and what the element there is that for uplift and making sure that we have a uniform understanding as customs officers is that we need to work together. So we really need to be communicating as to, okay, Australia's green customs strategy, based on the pillars of being, doing, and innovating. So with that, we, like I said, we're looking at turning off the lights in the building. So our infrastructure in the building, we're looking to turn off the lights. Whether or not, I think I might be a bit cynical here that that may not necessarily do a lot. But in the long term, if we're all taking the same approach, like perhaps that is actually something worthwhile. But if we are working only as Australia, only as New Zealand, only as Fiji, or only as China, we're not necessarily going to be getting that uplift that we really should be seeing for customs officers to be able to build out their knowledge and really deliver on what we're going to be expected to deliver on, because we're going to be asked for more, and we're going to be needing to know more. But we do rely on the WCO a lot to bring that forward and be the guiding point. And I know that there is a lot of work going on there, but it is certainly something I think that the continual discussion needs to occur and really push that collaboration piece for us to see meaningful change. I don't want to sound like a cynic there. I actually think there's a lot of really great work going on, but working together a lot more will actually mean that we have resources available that we didn't have before. Um, I'll move on to the next slide. I've spent a fair bit of time on that. So the policy and innovation piece is really, really critical to our border security and climate change agenda and how we look at that. So if we look at enhancing resilience and preparedness, so that resilience piece is a continual thread across responding to climate change across supply chains, international trade, how we actually deal with business, and our own internal processes. So if we're looking at investing in infrastructure, depending on our geographical regions, like how can we look at the infrastructure as being able to be operated continually if it does experience an extreme weather event. And I look at facilities, and facilities not just including our physical presence in a particular area, but also say if we have our IT systems and our storage in a particular facility, is that going to withstand an extreme weather event? So we can ensure the continuity of access and the continuity of data sharing if that's necessary. So that business continuity planning, which is the next point, has really become a focus of how we deal with the impacts of climate change. Um, COVID obviously played a significant part in turning our minds to a number of these things. So previously, there was a lot of discussion around resilience and business continuity, but it really solidified that need for us to actually build that in to uh, how we manage the borders. So if we look at the disaster management and business continuity. So business continuity planning really was addressed in the revised Kyoto Convention. So it's considered the overall process of developing an action plan to ensure the continuation of business in the event of an unexpected unavailability of a crucial system or facility. So that's that IT and data as well as the physical infrastructure. So our ability to maintain the collection of duties, control of goods, the movement of people is really critical to that business continuity. So it's not just the having it on paper, it's actually the practical measures and making sure that officers are aware of how to exercise business continuity plans. So having regular run throughs of what is a business continuity plan for a particular area and what are the actual consequences if it's not adhered to. Um, so if we also look at then the guidelines on disaster management and chain continuity, so supply chain continuity is really that critical piece there, because if in the event of a disaster or extreme weather event or changes to trade patterns, we really need to look at how we can lean in as a border administration um, to facilitate and ensure that continuity occurs so that there is not necessarily the driving up of the prices, the impact and uh, like resource scarcity due to lack of availability of fresh food, access to clean water. So if you look at the ability of identifying humanitarian actors who can import and transit or export relief supplies, fast tracking procedures using the WCO instruments and tools. And then, say, if we look at the fast track procedures, the part of that really is looking at authorized economic operator programs as a really good example there of how we can actually leverage those tools and those um, businesses that have those secure supply chains to lean into this element of supply chain continuity in the event that we are suffering from an extreme weather event or a climate induced impact. Um, so also in terms of international cooperation, I think the thread there has really been um, what I have been discussing and what Jamie has mentioned, that we actually really need to be working together, not individually, to ensure that there's uplift together. We are actually able to share accurate data. So a really great example of international cooperation is the Asia Pacific Plastic Waste Project. So that occurred in 2023, and we signed a regional action plan in the Asia Pacific in May 2023. So the project was really looking at illegal trade in plastic waste and facilitating legitimate trade. So in the Asia Pacific, and I'm sure in a number of other countries, um, illicit waste trade is a huge issue for us. And it's informed by the Basel Convention, which includes plastic waste. However, under the Basel Convention, it doesn't include non-hazardous plastic waste. So it's not covered in the scope, and it's actually regulated by domestic legislation. So the opportunity I see there is really that if we are in our domestic environments defining what non-hazardous plastic waste is, um, why aren't we coming together to have that uniform definition separate to the Basel Convention to define what non-hazardous plastic waste is? Because if we don't have that uniform understanding and definition, then we actually create gaps for ourselves between how we're regulating domestically and how we're actually applying it at the borders. So then sharing that information and working together, um, the intelligence piece is really critical to that uplift where we see that we may see something as being successful in our own right, in our own country. However, it might not actually be working when we're dealing with our neighbours. So really creating that harmonization of systems and processes, and really leading into that capacity building across a particular region. So then, if we look at Intel as well, we look at transnational organized crime groups in leading into this for this international cooperation piece. So really climate change makes things worse unless you're a transnational organized crime group. It actually is a big uh, money spinner and ultimately an accessible opportunity for you. So if we look at the impacts of climate change at on states, as Jamie was saying, the the changes to borders, displacement, it creates inequality and vulnerability, which actually is really something that transnational organized crime groups thrive off. So really, if we are looking at our gaps across our neighbours, are we creating opportunities for transnational organized crime groups to infiltrate? I think at some point Jamie and I discussed water being used as leverage and being able to be used as something that transnational organized crime were operating as, using resources and commodities that were in need to generate their own income, and that is something that we as customs administrations can have a really great opportunity to impact and infiltrate if we are working together to reduce those gaps across the borders. So policy and innovation, we've really looked at, and I think a lot of countries are looking at what they can do differently and what we can do better, leveraging technology to really build out something that hasn't been done before, or just a new way of looking at what we already do. So one of the activities that Australia is looking at is that can we integrate climate risk assessments into our border security planning, and looking at that for our authorised economic operator program, and really, so with the Australian entities that are seeking admission to the program, they are um, also not only providing a security risk management assessment of their supply chain, they're looking at integrating a climate risk assessment into their application to become part of it, or recognized as an authorized economic operator. So looking at their supply chains and the climate risks that they could potentially see based on their trade routes, and providing that to the Australian Border Force as part of their application. So really, that changing of thinking and that of the way of how they consider looking at their supply chain security, not just from a trusted insider or criminal element perspective and the traditional drugs or illicit items, but also looking at it from what is the impact if your supply chain was impacted by a climate event. So changing that way of thinking is really what we are striving for, and there's no right or wrong approach to this. It's more just tying it back in. Can we actually work together more? Can we, what knowledge gaps are there? Can we actually look at our border security planning and develop more in terms of the climate element as to responding to climate change? Green customs obviously is the starting point for customs administrations. What can we do next? So yeah. Does anybody have any thoughts or questions or any ideas that they've put forward um, in their own agencies to look at climate risk? Eric, thank you.
Yeah, I guess as more of a personal anecdote, I feel like I've dealt with a lot of this in the last 5 years of my 20-year career, especially from the Atlantic perspective. We talk about things like business continuity planning. I think I've activated our own plans more times, like I said, in the last 5 years than I ever have. I think that being personally displaced by forest fires, flooding, the rate of hurricanes on the Atlantic coast are increasing, making us having to divert to commercial traffic. Even the melting of the Northwest Passage, we've had to divert resources from our Marine Security Operations Center to cover vessels transiting between Greenland and Newfoundland. It's huge impacts, and I do find that digitalization, electronic clearances, paperless has been the way that we've been mitigating it here in the region. But having remote offices, alternative sites to go to continue to service stakeholders is really important, and to have those continuity plans in place is being the biggest benefit to us.
Do you find, Eric, that there's gaps in knowledge from you obviously across your business continuity activations, but when you're looking at that, go out into broader teams, do you see that there's gaps there? Is there a need for significant uplift in understanding the consequences of not understanding of business continuity?
Absolutely. It is a learning curve. It's not something that we've typically dealt with at any scale in the past. So getting ourselves up to speed in how we do this, I look at our own teams being tasked with, like we talked about, additional, additional tasks. Taking a Newfoundland Marine team and saying you're now going to be responsible for the Arctic, but we have no additional resources to provide you. It's how do we deal with that? It's really difficult. And as we have an aging population in Canada, and we have basically a cap on the amount of recruits we can put through our own college, the difficulty is only going to be on the rise, and we have to find mitigation strategies to deal with it.
Yeah, it's always that doing more with less piece that very much comes across, and I think in a lot of agencies. But I think the so what question is really going to be there for a lot of people when they're being tasked with these activities, like the so what of, okay, so if we don't take this on, what are the massive impacts of that? So I think there's in the chat, there's from Anthony, what is the significance of the circular economy in the context of contemporary border security? Actually, really interesting question. And I think that's something that I guess governments are really struggling with. And when I say governments, in the context of Australia, we at the Australian Border Force are really grappling with it, but we also are relying on our Department of Water, Climate Change, DECU, Department of Environment, Climate Change, Water and Environment. There's a lot in there. But the significance of the circular economy. So I really think there, and Jamie, you may have thoughts as well, is that we don't actually understand it enough. I know that with the WCO, we've put out the enforcement handbook for the circular economy, but I think it's really understanding how we can adjust our border processes for that, and not at the same time create further gaps that can be exploited. I actually don't see customs officers really applying an understanding of circular economy at at the Australian border at this point in time. And that is because our wider industry and domestic policies aren't really supportive of it, we don't really know what to do with it. And that's what I see a huge struggle for asking customs administrations to actually deliver on something that people don't really understand. And it's not for lack of trying, it's just actually not filtered down as being a priority at this stage in Australia. Um, I guess because it's so much a domestic issue as to how much we want to, I guess, engage in the circular economy. For Australia, it hasn't actually filtered to how we deal with it at our borders and our engagement with other countries. Um, but really, we are dealing with things that are of knowledge and gaps that create vulnerabilities. So obviously, the when we're dealing with the criminal element of things, that's actually going to be a piece that I'd say that organized crime groups are way ahead of us in looking at goods that can actually be used. That could I'm more thinking in terms of the financial crime element and trade-based money laundering when we're looking at the circular economy as well. Jamie, did you have any thoughts if you've looked into this
Yeah,
recently?
yeah, and you raised a couple of really good points, Alana, and I think it's a big challenge with it is, like you said, it really requires this cooperation on policy in order if we're talking about circular economy through supply chains. So just one example that kind of comes to mind about that is plastics are often talked about in circular economies and recycling. But one of the real unintended consequences of that, so lowering tariffs, for example, on recyclable plastics that are then shipped abroad, recycled, and then re-enter the supply chain. Well, what's happened is, sure, the tariffs are low, but those plastics actually arrive in that destination country, but it's still cheaper for that country to just make new plastics and send them back into the supply chain than to actually take the processes that are required to sanitize, recycle, all of that. So it actually becomes a bit of an asymmetry in policies there. And then another thing, and you bring up the financial crime element to it, is you're absolutely right, is when there's a policy in place like reducing tariffs on something that should be either a recyclable good or even a banned good, that just can't be and should be seized. Well, criminals grasp that and will actually start falsifying documents as well in order to, again, benefit from the lack of tariffs. Yeah, and Todd has some insights too.
Sorry, the other thing about when we talk about the circular economy, from a little bit of research I've done on this, the plastics, for example, Canada doesn't use recycled plastics because there's 15,000 poisons that have been banned by the government inside plastic. So we send these poisons abroad to be recycled elsewhere, and causes real environmental damage elsewhere. Similarly, you can think about paints that contain lead that are recycled. You can think about steel that's got nuclear material mixed into it. Things come and recycle out of hospitals, like X-ray machines. This stuff gets sent around the world to other countries, usually developing nations, that get stuck with these environmental hazards. So we also have to think about the environmental damage, not this sort of circular economy creates for our trading partners.
Yeah, one fix causes problems or not fix, I should say, causes problems for other areas as well. So absolutely.
Yeah, I think that inequality piece is really a big discussion point at all levels around how we actually are dealing with the issues that we've created for ourselves, but moving forward, because it's the most vulnerable nations and people that suffer the greatest impacts, and that here where we're looking at climate and financing activities to build out, say, supply chain resilience, and we're really seeing that we need to do those things just so that we aren't creating those further vulnerabilities and impacts on trade for people to access critical resources. But yeah, I think it's a really interesting piece that in terms of the circular economy, that I genuinely feel that it isn't something that we're equipped to deal with entirely at this point in time.
Thanks for that thoughtful insights. Any other questions or anything from anyone? Okay, well, we initially came up with that too. We were going to spend some time on this, but we won't because we're at the end of the day, and I'm sure there's a lot of you that are about ready for bed. So it's this is more something to think about then, as present company included. So something to think about in your evening, morning, whenever you want to think about this. In your own regions, think of an acute and the long-term environmental challenge that you're facing. And don't worry about explaining the environmental socioeconomic consequences, but think about that. So if whatever you're facing in your respective regions, how is that impacting people? How is that having further impacts on the environment? How is that impacting your economy? And then you want to think outside the box, think a bit wild on this, some policy recommendations that you can use to address this. Like I said, wicked problems require wicked solutions. And while there may not be a fundamental solution to this problem and our changing climate, we can play an active role in contributing to changing how others think in this space and changing how we ourselves think in this space. So have a think about those things overnight. If we have time tomorrow, we'll maybe talk about that at capstone time, or we can build it in.
Remind them what the questions are.
Yes. And as a reminder for tomorrow, please send in your questions. We've gotten a couple so far for our private sector partners as well, so we can flag with them. Please send that within the next hour or two if you can. We'll be able to flag it to them by the morning though. But just want to say a really big thank you again to Allanah. I know you now have a long work day ahead of you, so thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise with us. It's really appreciated. I think across today, there's been some really interesting, some of the trends that have really emerged in this. Everyone has talked so much about this, the need for cooperation and collaboration at a wider level. And when we bring it back to this climate challenge, none of us can do this alone. And it does require a real concerted effort from partners you may not have even thought of that could be involved in this.